Now you all can hear me. I'm Dani Nierenberg. I'm president and co-founder of Food Tank. What a pleasure to see you all. It's great to see so many people here. And we're going to have a really rich discussion about a new approach to meat. And I think we can probably all agree that a new approach is definitely needed. Discussions around the way we produce and consume food from animals have become increasingly contentious and binary with very little nuance or ability to hear from differing viewpoints. And so this panel is really an attempt to change that. So wish us luck as we begin on this conversation. So first, I will have a short discussion with Didier Toubia, the co-founder and CEO of Aleph Farms, which is a cultivated meat company based in Israel. Then we'll have a panel discussion with some of the foremost experts on nutrition, health, livestock, livelihoods, and the environment. And hopefully at the end of this discussion, we'll have a clear idea of how both meat and meat alternatives can help solve our climate emergency rather than contribute to it. So now I'm really pleased to introduce my friend Didier, the co-founder and CEO of Aleph Farms, a cultivated slaughter-free meat company based in Israel, as I said before. Full disclosure, I am on the advisory board of Aleph Farms, along with, Leonardo DiCaprio, a former astronaut, and some other cool folks. So no big deal. but Didier, I'm so pleased to see you here. Thank you so much for coming all this way. And if you want to say a little bit more about Aleph Farms, that would be great.
Thanks a lot, Dani. It's a great pleasure to be here with you all. And thanks for having me today. So I'm a food engineer and biologist by education. I've started my career in Western Africa, dealing with the malnutrition issues. And actually, I quickly got to the conclusion that the issues with the food system are systemic issues. They're not focused issues which you can solve with kind of providing focused support or solutions here and there. Today, on the global scale, I believe that we haven't really built a food system which is intended to feed the people. And actually, on one hand, we throw away 30% of our food, and 800 million people are malnourished. So the purpose of Aleph Farms is to provide one additional angle of a global effort which involved a lot of different stakeholders of the meat sector to really try and rethink how we can better manage our food system and the meat sector. Cultivated meat, which is what we do, is a new production system for meat. And I'll explain how it can contribute to the solution of the challenges I just highlighted as we continue discussion. A new production system for meat which relies on replicating the same natural phenomenon for muscle tissue, which is meat, forming spontaneously within the animal, but on the outside, directly using cells which are the building blocks of the meat we know, and reproducing the same natural cells which are found in animals on the outside, inside a controlled environment, so that they continue to assemble themselves and organize themselves into a similar muscle tissue. In nature, cells do need a matrix to attach upon in order to form a structured steak or a muscle, which is the extracellular matrix. In our case, we replace this matrix, which in nature is made of collagen and an animal protein, with a plant-based matrix, which is called a scaffold. And we end up with a whole muscle steak, which incorporates the same building blocks, muscle fibers, muscle cells, but also connective tissue and fat as the building blocks of the meat we can purchase today at the butcher shop. The benefits of this production process are, on one hand, that instead of sustaining the animal, a cattle, in the case of Aleph Farms, is focused on beef. Other companies are dealing with other species.
Absolutely.
Instead of sustaining a cattle for 1.5 years, 2 years, 3 years, then slaughtering it and processing its carcass and actually eating only 40% of his body weight, we can directly grow the steak from the same cells within 4 weeks with exactly the amount of nutrients, energy, water required to make the same meat. So reducing drastically the reliance on natural resources,
Sure.
but also reducing the impact on climate, and we can elaborate on that during this
Absolutely.
discussion. On top of that, we do avoid the use of antibiotics. Today, 700,000 people die every year from resistance to antibiotics, and this number should rise to 2 million by 2040. We also avoid contaminations in meat and foodborne illnesses. We avoid zoonotic diseases. And last but not least, we also provide a better alternative to concentrated operations for animal farming, which might address some concerns associated with animal welfare.
Sure, absolutely. No, thank you for that explanation. I think it's very clear in lots of ways. It's also very complex, and we can get into that in a moment. One of the things that you said that I think struck me is that you started your work in fighting food insecurity and malnutrition, and you realize more than most people that there is no silver bullet to this, and that Aleph Farms is trying to create another tool in the toolbox to solve the multiple crises we face around the impacts of industrial animal agriculture and animal welfare problems and so many other things. Why do you think these discussions, as I said before, become so binary that people don't understand often that there's a lot of nuance, that it's not just, there's not just one way to do this, that there are multiple ways to contribute. You can have multiple meat production systems, some that are slaughter-free, like Aleph Farms, others that are not. How do we get beyond sort of that contentious attitude into something that's more friendly for sure, but one where we can really come up with different solutions?
I believe there are probably a couple of reasons why. First, inherently as human beings, we tend to think in the framework of either or.
Sure.
It's difficult for us to envision choices which are not exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
It's a natural tendency of human beings. I believe that it's very important within those discussions about the food system transition and the meat sector transition
Mm-hmm.
to recognize that choices are not necessarily exclusive.
Right.
We might and we should discuss inclusive processes and approaches to succeed together, overcoming those critical and so important challenges which are affecting all of us. So the challenge is not exclusive, the challenge is inclusive, and the
Sure.
solutions should be inclusive as well. Beyond that, the meat sector is a very complex ecosystem with many stakeholders, and I think in the past, in the last, let's say, 5-10 years, there had been some attempts maybe to simplify a bit too much the issues and to categorize good solutions, bad solutions, meat is good, meat is bad. And it's clear that some of the meat sector players, especially the ranchers and the livestock farmers, are sometimes introduced as the bad guys, and they're a bit on the defensive while they're working first very hard, have very tough working conditions, earning little money many times, are facing demographic issues, facing issues of land reuse and desertification of their land, which is associated with industrial farming. They are facing attacks by some consumers groups and by some different interest groups. So they're a little bit on the defensive, and that's why it's very important to think together about common issues we're facing, and have an open discussion how we can together address those issues and find the right solution. We do see cultivated meat as a new form of domestication, actually. So we do see it as part of agriculture.
Uh-huh.
It's called cellular agriculture. Cellular agriculture is those methods which are producing agricultural products based on cell and tissue cultures. And same as 10,000 years ago, people were able to incorporate a spontaneous phenomenon for animals to reproduce and grow in the wild into a controlled environment, and they started to domesticate animals. What we do with cultivated meat is exactly implementing the same concept, but on the level of the edible part of the animal. We start by watching nature and how cells naturally divide and how meat is formed inside the animal. and we incorporate this phenomenon under controlled environments. We really do see cultivated meat as an evolution of agriculture, rather than an can say opposing or a conflicting approach, and that's important to understand. At the end of the day, the role of the farmers is the role to feed the world. So if the farmers are not on board and the agricultural ecosystem does not incorporate those innovations and those new practices, they will not be able to fulfill their potential of feeding the world.
Absolutely, and I think it's so important what you raised, that we can't blame farmers, especially industrial animal agriculture farmers, for the position that they are in right now. That is, there are lots of processes outside of those farming systems that influence how animals are raised. And often farmers are caught in a vicious cycle that they can't get out of. And you recently co-authored a white paper with your colleague Lee Recht that talked about this need for the just transition to more sustainable food systems that include a lot of different tools, as we've talked about. How do you include livestock farmers in these conversations?
We do see a trend over the course of the last 5-10 years for a transition of conventional farming toward sustainable practices. Mm-hmm. In the US, for instance, Cargill, which is one of our partners and investor on Aleph Farms, has committed to return 10 million acres of farmland in North America to regenerative practices. PepsiCo is working the same path. Nestle recently announced over 1 billion euros investment in turning their supply chain into regenerative, and the consumers are asking for more organic and grass-fed meat. We believe this trend will continue to develop and will accelerate. And beyond regenerative and sustainable animal farming practices, we do see cultivated meat as a second category of meat. Uh-huh. Same as we have today white and red wine, which are two different types of wines, sharing the same basic attributes of wines, but with a different value proposition and not necessarily interchangeable. We believe that in 5-10 years, we'll have the choice between two types of meat. Meat harvested from the carcass of a slaughtered animal, the conventional way, and cultivated meat, none coming from a slaughtered animal, each with different positioning in the market, value proposition, and not necessarily interchangeable and supplementing one the other. We believe that for the meat sector to succeed, we need on one hand to accelerate this trend towards sustainable farming, and on the other hand, to incorporate what we call transformational innovation, and Lee can maybe elaborate on that later on during the panel, which is about new production systems which are in balance with nature and can actually provide for the farmers, on one hand, additional revenues, but also potentially address demographic issues with the younger generation and farmers, and attracting them into the farm and supporting those new generation into making the step and taking over the farm with more advanced practices, investing in training. We believe that instead of artificially sustaining or supporting a lot of farms in France, for instance, which is a country and over 53% of the livestock farms are technically bankrupted and artificially maintained in activity by subsidies. In the UK, it's approximately the same numbers. The average revenues of a farmer in France is 6,000 euros per year. And same as in France, in the US, most of the livestock farmers have a second job to sustain their families. Right. So if we can, instead of subsidies, invest part of this money in training, in incorporating innovation, in deregulating the system in order to enable the farmers to upgrade their business toward higher value-add products, and especially attracting the new generation, it can be a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely, that's really important to attract that next generation of farmers. Sorry, my mic keeps falling. One of the things that I want to ask you about, can you imagine a farm or a facility where there are farmers practicing, practicing regenerative agriculture and incorporating real livestock, real live livestock into that, and also helping Aleph Farms complete its mission? Can they do both things? Could a farmer do both things?
Yes, why not? First, at Aleph Farms, we believe that we need animals. First, because animals have a role in regenerating the soils. we probably need less animals and better manage and with a planned livestock activity over time, incorporating regenerative practices. But we do need animals for regenerative agriculture. Animals are also part of the landscape, which is important. There's also a very strong connection in many cultures to
Right.
animal agriculture and animal farming. So there's a cultural aspect, a social aspect around animal farming, and all those angles are very important to integrate, to incorporate, to recognize as we think about the transition. So the transition has to involve animals. On the other hand, the system which we rely on today for producing animal protein, which was very well fitted for feeding 1 billion people in 1900,
Sure.
which was just 120 years ago.
Right.
We were 1 billion on Earth, go to the 7.8 billion. The same system is not scalable enough to really feed everyone equally and provide food security for everyone. So we need to incorporate innovation in order to adjust the system to the size of the population and to the requirements of the human species of today.
Absolutely. I mean, that culture of meat is so important. We need more equality and equity, obviously, in all of our food systems, but particularly in animal agriculture, where there's a big divide between sort of the haves and have-nots. I want to go back a little to what you talked about, sort of the complexity of but also the simplicity of cultivated meat, and you talked about this matrix and the scaffolding that is needed, and the nerdy really side of me wants to know more about how that is built, because I think it's so interesting.
The meat we know today is composed of cells, same as any other tissue or organ in the living world, and those cells actually grow together and interact together in order to form specific structure, which is a muscle tissue, which is actually a steak. The challenge of reproducing the same phenomenon and as closely as possible mimic this natural process outside of an animal are huge. Actually, we need to mimicking nature is complicated. We've done that, and I think that's part of the technology is about mimicking nature in principle, and I think the human species has been good at that. For instance, electricity is about mimicking nature. Electricity is a natural phenomenon which we've been able to master and control and produce electricity under our own control. For instance, even the wheel has been invented by watching nature and a stone actually rolling down a hill.
Sure.
And we kind of incorporated this phenomenon into control design and the control manner. So what we're trying to do with cultivated meat is really to implement the same concept of watching nature, learning from nature, and incorporating the same concepts which we see occurring spontaneously around us for the purpose of human progress. What makes Aleph farms kind of slightly different within industry is, on one hand, the focus on quality meat. We focus on steaks, and we define 3 dimensions of quality: culinary quality, nutritional quality, and sensory quality. We work with cells which are non-genetically engineered and non-immortalized, which we believe will be very important for consumer acceptance.
Absolutely.
But also for regulatory legislations in different parts of the world. And third, we also have developed unique technologies which can help us reduce the production cost to reach price parity within 5 years from launch. So this is actually the concept behind cultivated meat. Those products are not yet in the market. There is one first product which has been cleared in Singapore. We expect to have more products cleared in the US and in other parts of the world over the course of the next 12 to 24 months.
So exciting. Can you talk about the energy costs of cultivated meat?
Yes. There had been a few studies published recently by academic groups. The only study which really relies on data from the industry is a study which has been published last year by C Delft in Europe. We contributed also to the data. They worked with 15 groups, industrial groups on the production side and supply chain level as well. And it demonstrated that cultivated meat can reduce the carbon emissions by 92% versus an average of industrial farming practices or intensive farming practices. We can reduce and that's important because actually the food system itself as a whole accounts for 25 to 30% of the global greenhouse gases. The recent data tend to 30%, and livestock is responsible for half of it. So if we're talking about a net zero transition and decarbonizing the economy, which is very spoken obviously at COP26, we can't really reach our net zero goals, especially in the Western world, which is a net exporter of livestock and beef, without rethinking the way we manage our food system. And within the food system, livestock is the key to achieve the goal. So it is very significant. Beyond that, we can reduce the use of water by 78%. Livestock, especially beef, is one of the largest consumers of water globally. We can also reduce the amount of land by 98%. As you might know, between 35 and 48% of the crops harvested every year are intended for animal feed. And the intensive farming of crops like maize and soy for animal feed is one of the primary drivers of deforestation in the Amazon, but not only, and of desertification. We lost 30% of our arable land globally over the course of the last 50 years. Sure. So if we can reduce the amount of inputs and revert part of those lands to forest and restore biodiversity, we can help targeting the climate change objectives with restoring the forests, which have a great role not only for biodiversity, but also for mitigating the climate. Beyond that, we really believe that within the net zero strategies, methane, actually cattle is emitting methane primarily through enteric fermentation and also through the process for managing manure from cows. In our views, the key to reach 2030 targets and potentially 2040 is not carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is important and fossil fuel reduction is important for the long term, but actually carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere forever, for hundreds of years. So in the positive scenario where we can reach zero carbon emission and carbon dioxide emission by 2050, the carbon will continue to accumulate in the atmosphere until then, and then the augmented quantity we'll have in 2050 will stay in the atmosphere forever, meaning that it will not help changing the direction of climate change. Mm-hmm. It will slow down the journey, which is today we're driving in the wrong direction on the highway, so we'll drive slowly in the wrong direction. The way to change the direction of our drive is actually to reduce methane. Why? Because methane has a potential for climate change which is 80 times higher than carbon dioxide on the short term, and it stays in the atmosphere only for 10 years. So if we can actually reduce 1 point of emission of methane, it's equivalent to reducing 80 pounds of emissions of carbon dioxide. But beyond that, after 10 years, it's those 80 pounds which are removed from the atmosphere. So those are not emissions which stay forever in the atmosphere. It really helps changing the direction and reducing the overall effect of climate change from anthropogenic activities. Sure. So we're very excited about the recent announcement last week. Actually, I believe 60 countries announced a pledge to reduce methane emission by 30%. We believe that is the only way to change the direction with climate change. And cultivated meat can obviously contribute greatly to that. The primary emitter of methane in the US is livestock. Then we have natural gas and oil extraction. Sure. So if we can reduce livestock emission by half, we can actually, that's enough to change the direction of climate change, it's huge.
Absolutely.
So everyone talks about removing fossil fuel, which is important, but there are quick wins we can achieve from other directions, which we shouldn't overlook.
Absolutely, and being able to reverse this trajectory that we're on would be incredible. If I were listening to this conversation in this audience or watching it at home, I would think, okay, this sounds wonderful. This sounds great, but how much is this going to cost me as a consumer? We talk a lot about accessibility and affordability and equality and inequity. How do we make this available to a wide range of eaters?
Cultivated meat, it's still at its infancy, and there are challenges to make it a reality in the mass market. One challenge is definitely the ability of the industry to build relatively quickly the production infrastructure which will be able to meet the demand for meat. And here there are actually a couple of angles to this challenge. First, we're reinventing the way and the processes for growing cells and developing tissues. The initial technologies we've been working with have been transferred from the biomedical industry, and they can't serve as a base for scaling up food production process. Second, it's also a very capital intensive production process.
Right.
So we're working on strategies to make sure that we can actually fund this increase in scale through partnerships, working with 6 different corporate globally, including Cargill in the US,
Right.
BRF in Brazil, Migros in Switzerland, Thai Union in Southeast Asia, Mitsubishi in Japan, which beyond making cars is also a $28 billion food company and meat producer. So working as an ecosystem. We also believe that we need a government alignment with those objectives.
Absolutely.
To make it happen. So there are a few challenges to overcome. We believe that once we reach the market, cultivated meat will be slightly more expensive than conventional meat, probably by a few tenths of percent. I assume 30 to 50%.
Sure.
And we have a clear roadmap at Aleph Farms for reaching cost parity within 5 years from initial launch, which, by the way, is much quicker than the time it takes to the new generation of plant-based products to reach price parity.
Sure.
And here again, when we talk about price parity, it's not an absolute criteria, because price parity is very much dependent on what you compare to. At Aleph Farms, we focus on beef and steaks, which are obviously sold at a much higher price than, for instance, minced chicken. So it's much easier for us to reach price parity. I believe that for chicken, it will probably take more time.
So interesting. We only have a few minutes left, and I've had the opportunity to talk to Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods, several times this week. I've talked to him before, and he wants sort of this abolition of livestock farming. He wants to eliminate all livestock farming, while at the same time creating a product that, while very tasty, is ultra processed in many ways. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the alternative meat sector. We talked about, the cultivated meat sector and sort of, our traditional meat sector. What about this alternative protein sector, and where do you see it going as somebody who thinks about these issues all the time?
Obviously, we have different views than Pat Brown on many issues, but I respect him very much, and I think I give him a lot of credit for what he has achieved. We believe that on the difference to plant-based meat analogs, cultivated meat has potential not only to provide whole muscle meat, but also to provide the nutrition security needed. Actually, today, I believe 28% of the meat alternative, the plant-based meat alternatives in the US do not comply with the minimum requirement for being considered high in protein or good source of protein. They're primarily carbohydrates. Another issue with plant-based meat is that it does not cook like meat, which is a problem not only for the consumers at home, but also for the food service. But still, we believe there is a room for plant-based. Again, different products than cultivated meat, but there is a room for plant-based in the market. And there are good products over there. Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat are good products. In our views, in order to really drive a transition and go mainstream, we need to stick to meat because meat is a unique product. Meat is not just a functional product, which is intended for satisfying, hunger. Meat is a very emotional product. When we eat meat, we eat what meat represents for us. Meat is an experience. And at Aleph Farms, when we're talking about our 3 dimensions of quality, we're really recognize that meat is part of the food culture and will not disappear tomorrow morning.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you so much, Didier. Let's give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you, Danielle.
So give us a few minutes to make some transitions on stage, and then we'll invite our panel up. Thank you, Didier.
Thank you.
I'd like to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This is a really amazing group of panelists, and I just want to introduce them briefly. I'll go in alphabetical order. I think I have them. Well, Pete Richie's here, so I don't have them in alphabetical order. We had to trade out of panelists. So Lasse, I'm pleased to have you here. Lasse is the Global Director of 50 by 40. Do you want to say a few words about yourself just very briefly?
Sure. Sure, happy to do that. I'm Lasse Bruun. I'm actually the CEO of 50 by 40. And 50 by 40 is a collective impact organization. So we have 70 organizations based all over the world that works on different issues related to food, whether it's climate change, faith, social justice, biodiversity, animal issues, or on nutrition. We have it covered, and we're trying to find a common way forward.
Wonderful. So nice to have you here. Pete Richie, would you like to go next? My good friend from Nourish Scotland.
Sure, yes, I work for Nourish Scotland. I also look after some cows.
Brent Loken from WWF.
I work for WWF food issues, anything related to food. So.
And you were also a lead author on the Eat Lancet report, which I'm sure will come up in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure it will.
Stineke, you're a nutritionist and an agricultural economist, and someone I admire so much. You were with UN Nutrition. Do you want to say a few words?
Well, maybe just UN Nutrition is quite new, just to say that we work towards policy coherence across and within the UN system for nutrition, advocate for nutrition in climate COP, for example, in biodiversity, trade, wherever it's needed, and then again bring those messages down to the countries to ensure consistent and coherent and coordinated programming and projects at country across the UN agencies.
Wonderful description, thank you. Aarti Ramachandran, you are with the FAIRR initiative. Thank you so much for being here. This is the first time we're meeting. I apologize.
Thank you, Danielle. Very, very excited to be here. Thank you for having me. We are a network of institutional investors. Our members are asset owners, asset managers. They own or manage around 45 trillion in assets. And so we've been working to engage the institutional investor community on sustainable food issues and many of the issues that Danielle and Didier discussed earlier.
Just 45 trillion, that's all?
Just 45. It's a drop in the bucket, truly.
And last but not least, someone I consider a true friend and a mentor, Dr. Recht from Aleph Farms.
It's really nice to be here. Thank you. So I think you know Aleph Farms after this interview with Didier. So I'm excited to start the panel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Pete, I think I want to turn to you first, because which one of you is not like the others? And that's you. You have a very, very different perspective, I think, than other folks on this panel, because you're actually raising animals, but you have this, intellectual background on food system issues. How do you sort of marry the two?
Well, I thought it was great to hear from Aleph Farms and to hear this idea about sort of peaceful coexistence, if you like. I do find some of the grandiosity of the, we're going to get rid of all livestock tomorrow claims just frankly ridiculous. They're not based on reality, they're based on a sort of extrapolation rather than actually understanding the nature of food systems and livestock systems and livelihoods and how long change takes to happen, even if people want to see a world without livestock. It's not going to happen certainly in my lifetime, and probably not in any of your lifetimes either. But I also want to make the case that, not all cows are the same. Mm-hmm. This is a very obvious thing to say. My cows live on marginal land. It's not suitable for cropping. 25% of the farm is in trees. We're in a carbon sequesterer. My cows eat grass. They drink water that falls from the sky. It really is a very simple low input system. They get no grain, they get no fertilizer, they get no pesticide, and the farm is a haven of biodiversity. So my cows aren't really actually doing very much harm. And if I could get with the program and actually use some of the new technology in terms of low methane breeding, I could probably reduce the methane emissions from my herd by 50% simply through non-invasive genomic testing of rumens to select for cows which are naturally low methane emitters. So I think there's a sort of tendency to lump all these issues together and say, land use, sure, 75% of Central Asia, as we heard earlier in the week, is rangelands. it's not land that you're going to use for something else. So this idea that we're running out of land is also simply not true. There's more than enough land in the world, and there's certainly much more than enough sea in the world to feed everybody very comfortably, indefinitely. You know, we have the technology to produce much more food than we need, and the only reason people are hungry is they don't have any money. And that's the only reason people have ever really gone hungry is because they don't have any money, except when we had very limited trade and very capacity to move food around. But for most of human history, people who've gone hungry have been people who don't have any money.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I'm glad you said that, not all meat is created equal. And Stineke, if I can turn to you now, as someone who works at UN Nutrition, your job is to make sure that we're not just focusing on one food, that we're, looking at very sustainable diets, but in a way that doesn't exclude other food sources. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why a holistic approach to how we think about meat and animal foods is important.
Thank you so much for asking. Otherwise, I would have spoken just spontaneously. Now, I think it's so important not just to speak about meat or apples or, one single food, because one single food will not do the trick of nourishing us. We need sustainable, healthy diets, as you already said, Danny. And that's what we need to look at. And then we can take that next step. Okay, what does a sustainable, healthy diet look like? Mm-hmm. What are the elements? And basically, listening to World Health Organization, there's lots of fruits and vegetables and plant-based products in there, but also there is moderated amounts of and limited amounts of red meat and moderate amounts of fish and aquatic foods. So that should be our starting point. And then, of course, it's important to look also at the production and the food system as a whole to see what is the best way to acquire those elements. Is that enough, or should I go on?
You can go on a little bit longer, I think, because I think there's a lot in there.
Yeah, so just going back to sustainable, healthy diets, it's healthy and it's sustainable. And sustainable from an environmental perspective, but also from a social and financial perspective. Because when we would follow a sustainable, healthy diet, already greenhouse gas emissions, water use, land use would go down as compared to a less healthy diet. So that's one. Then if we would then include sustainability criteria, sure, it would really make that cause even stronger. Sustainable healthy diets are also culturally acceptable, and they are also rooted in the possibilities of the soil, water, and the agroecological context of that area. So that's so important to take into account. A sustainable healthy diet in Japan would be completely different from a sustainable healthy diet here in Scotland. And that's what we should be working towards. There is, however, one big issue. You may have read the report from FAO and other WFP, IFAD, UNICEF and WHO about the state of food insecurity in the world this year.
Yes.
It says 3 billion people nowadays don't have access to a healthy diet. So we are not there yet.
Right.
So the system we have currently, we need to transform it. We need to make sure that people have access to a sustainable, healthy diet, and how to do that is one of those measures. Try to curb those subsidies that now sustain maybe 3 main crops, maize to feed many animals, for example, rice and wheat, and then a few animal species only. We need much more diversity, and our agric subsidies are much too narrowly focused on only a few crops. We need more diversity in the system.
Well said, and we talked about subsidies a little bit with Didier, and I want to get into that later. But you brought up a really important point about the need for socially, environmentally, and economically sustainable food systems that are culturally appropriate. And Brent, if I could turn to you now, many of us have heard that we have to think carefully about our meat consumption practices to help protect the planet. Is there science behind this? Is there a science that really makes the connection between meat consumption and the climate crisis?
Oh, yeah. I'm going to get in trouble no matter what I say here. Because the thing with science is you can find science that says anything, it seems like nowadays. So let me start with the Eat Lancet. Since that was brought up. The Eat Lancet was this report that we published back in 2019 now. the main goal is that we identified early on was that there weren't global targets for what defined a healthy diet and global targets for what defined a sustainable food system, sustainable food production. So we set forth, took that first step to say, can we put forth some definable, quantifiable metrics that tell us what food we should be eating from a health perspective and what food we should be eating from if we want to protect the planet. If we want to stay within planetary boundaries, how much food could we actually produce? And when we worked on the Eat Lancet, what we did is we put this very strong firewall between the healthy diet and the environmental side of things, because we wanted to make sure that we didn't mix and match and say, well, if we want to save the planet, then let's work backwards and say what we should be eating. We wanted to say, if we wanted to have a healthy body, what do we eat? If we want to like have this food and actually produce it, how much can the earth actually tolerate? And can those two systems come together? Mm-hmm. They can. And they absolutely clearly can. We can feed up to 10 billion people within planetary boundaries. The healthy diet that you were just talking about, which is a theme of plant-based diets with some meat. So it absolutely can be done. And we scoured the literature, and this was probably the most comprehensive literature review that we put forth out there in terms of saying, what is the state of play? What is the science saying on this topic? So it absolutely can be done. Interesting is that with the Eat Lancet, it stirred up so much emotion and continues to stir up emotion. Mm-hmm. Even mentioning it feels a bit weird. Because people automatically took that and they say, oh, you're anti-meat, you're promoting a vegan agenda and vegetarian agenda. And they say, it's like, you didn't read the report, did you? Because we clearly said up to 5 to 6 servings of animal source foods per week. And if you're looking at seafood and some other things, it could be even more than that. So sure, we can't maintain current consumption patterns in some parts of the world. But in many parts of the world, we have to increase consumption patterns, and that absolutely can be done. But it's just this rebalancing of food and who eats what. And, it says right here, everyone has a right to healthy and sustainable food. Absolutely. And this was the heart of the Eat Lancet, saying that if we take that seriously, how do we do it? And it can be done. It's not going to be easy, but it absolutely can be done. Well, and the science points to that.
Well, let's talk about that point that it's not going to be easy. Who is it not going to be easy for? It's going to not be easy for you and me, but for people who live in other parts of the world who, are not getting a healthy and sustainable diet right now, their lives will improve.
Their lives will improve. Yeah. So, absolutely. So there's still 811 million people that go to bed hungry, and that's one of the things that we have to solve. I think it's not going to be easy for those individuals that are going to have to change their diets, that are going to have to reduce consumption patterns, that are going to have to not eat meat every single day. So yeah, it's going to mean different things to different people.
Sure.
But implementation of the not easy fact, how we do that is something that I think would be very interesting to unpack. There's not going to be any single solution that will actually get us there. It's going to be a combination of many solutions, and it's great that we're here to actually talk about one of the most important solutions, which is meat.
Absolutely.
Meat and livestock.
Lasse, if I could turn to you. I mean, we've had discussions on the big rift in civil society around sustainable meat versus, alternative meat. And what, Brent just identified is like some of us will have to change our consumption practices. That's not a bad thing, right? There are things we will gain from doing that, lots of different things. And I'm wondering if you can touch on, one, that big rift that we're seeing among civil society, and two, what we will gain from shifting our consumption practices in the global north.
Yes, thank you for that question. And I wholeheartedly agree with the comments that have been made before here. Well, I just want to first say one thing. I mean, we need to acknowledge that business as usual is not a way forward, right? I mean, it goes without saying, but it should be mentioned. We cannot continue with the trajectory of population growth, the way people are eating in the global north. That's not going to fly in the future. And maybe there needs to be some ways we have to change our lives, not just we need to eat less meat in the global north. We also need to drive less. We need to have smaller houses. We need to fly less. There are certain things, and it's about equity. It's in this case about equitable food distribution. And speaking to the point made by Pete, the aspect of how do we use the land, right? So just to make that clear. In terms of what goes on in the movement now, the movement is not just civil society. I think it goes beyond that. There is this rift between a so-called technical solution and adhering to principles of social justice. And from my perspective, both are important and both can be intertwined in a good way. But right now we are seeing on one hand organizations or companies like Aleph Farms and others who are pointing to a technical solution. Some people think it's a great thing, the best thing since sliced bread, and others think it's a very bad thing because they will see that it is a continuation of corporate control, who owns the food, and they think it doesn't abide to the principles of just transition, of food sovereignty and social justice. So what do we do about that? Because we see how this rift is actually splitting the movement apart.
Right.
And those we kind of collectively are trying to change, particularly the big livestock industry players. We need to find a way to have a common ground to take this forward, because otherwise we're not going to make it. So how do we do that? There's no single answers, but I think we need a stronger analysis, and for that we need roadmaps, particularly adhering to 2030 and the implementation of the SDGs. Where are we now and where do we need to be in 2030? And have a clear analysis and talk about who benefits from the change and who loses out, and how do we deal with those who are losing out. That's one of the things. And also think on one hand, those who are on the technological side, they need to understand that it's just not a one-for-one. We cannot make all the Burger Kings in the world just shift to plant-based or cell-based meat. It's not going to solve the problem. It's part of the solution. It's a transition. On the other hand, those in the social justice movement also need to understand we need to move a little bit faster. The house is on fire, and unless we take all means to put out that fire, nobody's going to make it.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to the nuance that's needed. This is not a black and white conversation. It's very, very gray, and we need to really embrace that. And it's uncomfortable, but we need to also embrace the uncomfortableness of it, I think. Aarti, I'd like to turn to you now, and given what Lasse has just said, what is the role for the investment community to play in creating these transitions that are absolutely necessary?
So about 5 years ago, there wasn't a role really for the institutional investor community, because the fundamental thesis when investing in food systems and in the food sector was, demographics were sort of the primary driver of investments in food, right? So you were getting emerging markets, as the middle class continued to grow, those demographics were changing, that was going to increase meat consumption, so the trends were just going to go up. But that was a fundamentally flawed thesis from our perspective, because it didn't consider a whole range of risks that were sort of waiting in line, that was going to alter and change how the cost space for the meat sector and the animal protein sector in general. Now, obviously, Pete's sort of cows are not the problem. The problem is the hundreds of thousands of cows, the hundreds of thousands of pigs, the billions of chickens that we are industrially producing at this stage with very few environmental and social guardrails. And when you start putting in those guardrails, as you will with the 30%, the methane reduction efforts that are going to come in place, you're already seeing governments where there's a concentration of animal farms that are beginning to look at what kind of regulation. For example, New Zealand, a large part of their net zero target is obviously about addressing methane emissions, most of which are linked to their big dairy and beef sectors. So they're going to start focusing on this sector, which means costs are going to go up. Second, feed prices, you've seen a lot of volatility in the last few years. I mean, of course, there's a general inflationary trend, but what you're also seeing is a large part of the driver is linked to climate risk. You've got significant weather-related events that are happening in places like Brazil and the US that have really devastated corn production and soy production, which are the main feed inputs. That's going to continue. It's going to exacerbate. That's going to have an impact on animal protein producers. So everything. I mean, you've got a lot of regulation on the welfare front coming in. The ideas around what makes this sector cost efficient. That is, sort of smaller space, optimizing for production constantly, faster growing breeds. All of that are under attack, right, from consumers. Consumers, at least in developed countries, no longer want to accept that. And so pollution, when you take biodiversity, this is a sector that's going to be, and the disruptive potential of alternative proteins, this is a sector that's going to be under an immense amount of pressure. And what we are seeing is that investors are beginning to focus on that specific aspect in both from a sustainability perspective, but also a financial perspective, and sort of that fundamental thesis that this is a sector that's going to continue to grow is now being challenged, I think, by institutional investors. And they want to see companies beginning to start seeing the trends and responding to them. And just very quickly, I'll end with the fact that, I used to work at a large oil sort of gas company 10 years ago. This was a company they were the smartest guys in the room. They sort of thought they really had it down in terms of they knew where what the future held. Come today, the board's been completely challenged. They've lost a whole lot of market value. They were the most valuable company in the world. It sort of dropped down the list. And they're having to make a huge pivot. And they've just lost 10 years sort of striving towards that. And so I think the question is, how is the food sector going to react? How are the big food producers, the meat producers, the animal protein producers, how are they going to react to these trends? Do they recognize them, or will they respond to them? Or will they sort of be the dinosaurs in the room and get taken over by the next big company?
That's such a great point. And I think, Lee, that leads into Aleph's work. You're working with Cargill. You're working with other big meat companies. And I'm wondering how that influences your work and how they're responding to you. Obviously, they don't want to be the dinosaurs in the room. They want to be on the positive side of this transition. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I just want to kind of give it a little bit of context, and I think this is something important. Listening also to Pete, listening to all of you. I think we all share kind of the same view. We're all aiming for the same goal. Whether we're the farmers, whether we're the producers, whether we're alternative protein companies, cultivated meat companies, we all want food security. We all want resiliency in our food systems. And we all want to make sure that we're moving towards a more climate-friendly economy. This is not something that is only focused on a very specific niche within the food system. We're all aiming for that. When we look at these farmers, when we look at these livestock farmers, I was listening to the secretary, the state secretary of agriculture of the USA, and he was mentioning that 89.6% of the farmers have second jobs. They are not doing this because they're looking at profit. They're doing it because they are big believers that they are feeding the world, and they see it as something that's emotionally and important for them. So it's not like here are the good people versus the bad people, and here are the right people versus the wrong people. And that's something that needs to be, I think, and we look at it and we talk about just transition, and the just transition came from the energy sector. And the energy sector came and said, here we are. We need to transition to renewable energies. And then we started dividing this to petroleum energy versus renewable energy. And that kind of created this, these two parallel groups and these two parallel silos. And it made it more difficult to achieve a mutual goal of sustainable ways of producing, of living. And I think that this is something that the food systems, and specifically the meat sector, can really actually have lessons learned from. Yeah. There shouldn't be one side here versus one side there. We're all aiming for the same goal. We're aiming to produce healthy, sustainable food. I do believe that. I do believe that this is something that's critical. So for us, at Aleph Farms, it is really important for us that we work within the meat sector, whether it's with the meat producers, but also actually with the livestock farmers. This is something that's critical for us, that we can try to see how we can enter this lively sector that's going through, I would say, is in the midst of the controversial, issues of the world, and see where we can give value. And it can be value in many ways. It can be value through environmental aspects that Didier was speaking about, next generations of the farmers. Now, globally, worldwide, farmers are, this is a very family traditional kind of family businesses, and younger generations they don't want to take on the family business, because the majority of them are going to anyways have to take a second job as it is. So let's think about how we can resolve that. There are issues of moral issues. There are issues of financial issues here. There's a lot of struggling here. So we have to kind of look at all of this and approach it in a way where we can move forward and give value as we work together. And I think that's something that needs to be a little bit more put emphasis on, and how we can work together.
Sure.
Because in the end, we do have the same goal. And yes, we have to make changes. And yes, there are going to be people that are going to be impacted. And yes, there are going to be people that are, moving forward is painful. It is not an easy thing. And there are going to be people that are going to, I guess, enjoy it more and enjoy it less. But in general, there are over 1 billion people today that their livelihood relies on the meat sector. You cannot ignore that kind of a number. That's a critical number when we were looking forward and thinking about how we can transition to a more sustainable and resilient meat sector. That is a number that cannot be ignored.
Right.
And I think that as long as we kind of look at it into these two groups, or into the good and the bad, and to the sustainable versus the non-sustainable, then we're missing the market here.
Absolutely. I mean, these binary discussions aren't working. I guess my question for you all is, I am struggling personally with like imagining what this just transition in the meat sector looks like. I'm struggling. I don't know what it looks like. So I'd like to hear, whoever wants to jump in here. Maybe you go first, Brent. I don't know what it looks like.
I don't either. So I'm not going to even, I don't know, maybe you guys have a better idea, but what I do know is that, building on something that you said, Lasse, is that we have to address consumption at its root cause, and we have to be very open and honest and have those conversations, and not just say this has to be done because we all want the same goals, which is true, but not everybody does. And for example, Kylie Jenner, 250 million followers on Instagram. She posts videos about these clothes and shoes, over 1,000 pairs of shoes that she just wears one time, and she gets hundreds of thousands of likes. After the Australian wildfires, Greta Thunberg tweeted about that we're not making that connection with extreme events and also climate change. Kylie Jenner said it's terrible that all these animals are being killed, and then followed that up with her next post on, and here's my $1,500 mink slippers, everybody buy them, and people are liking it. Jay-Z, for his 21 millionth follower on Instagram, ate 21 hamburgers. People love it. So at one point we can say Greta Thunberg has 16 million followers on Twitter. That's great. She's the conscience of the youth. But Kylie Jenner is the influencer of the youth. And until that type of behavior becomes looked at and said, we don't accept that anymore, that type of behavior said, we're not going to embrace people eating 21 hamburgers or this overindulgence, I don't think we're going to be able to get anywhere.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Thank you. Yeah, please. Yeah, it is very interesting. Pete, I'd like to hear from you. I mean, how do we get away from Kylie Jenner?
We do sound like a bunch of old fogies, don't we? Talk about the youth today and all that stuff. But I think your point is really important about, the point of all this is to nourish people. And we know that at the moment, the world food system is skewed towards calories, away from fruit and veg, away from nuts, away from legumes, and your point about realigning subsidies so that we buy the right things is absolutely right. But, there's this sort of odd issue about subsidies and, different things, because we don't all want the same things. And there's a very strong, feeling from the right, we should get rid of subsidies. 48% of the EU economy, GDP, is public spending. 44% of the US is public spending, even before the pandemic. So, we can spend public money to get public outcomes that we want to see. We just have to figure out ways of doing it. That makes sense. But in terms of what you say, your question about the just transition in the livestock sector, I'm sure that we will see fewer farmers in the world in the future because, as you say, it's very hard and there's better jobs in the cities. And, my son's a case in point. He's left the farm to go and work in the city, That happens, and it will continue to happen, and there'll be some. But we don't want this sort of abrupt, mass loss of farms over time. So we do have to provide income support. We have to cushion those changes for people as they go on, and trying to find an alternative to nitrogen subsidies would be really, really important part of that. And China's made some real progress on that. So, there are good things happening in that space. But for me, in terms of just transition, the framing I would use is this low opportunity cost livestock,
Sure.
And to say, look, where livestock can eat stuff we can't eat, where they can contribute to ecosystems, where they can eat waste food, where they can, be part of a circular economy of food,
Right.
They have a place. And that's got to be high welfare. And the sad thing is, because our business model is still very 19th century, still very
Absolutely.
economies of scale, still very linear, we've pushed things so that we have hundreds of thousands of chickens, hundreds of thousands of pigs, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands of cows, confined in unimaginably horrible conditions.
Absolutely.
And the people who work in those systems, as you say, are just, it's not what we were made to do.
No.
And it's not what animals were made for either. And we have to sort of sit back from that and say, I don't think any of us really want to live in a future where, we are sort of going along with that level of cruelty and degradation in
Absolutely.
the future. So I think, much fewer animals that are fitting in with ecosystems, that have relationships with their keepers, that are part of, a circular economy, and, as Brent says, a bit of meat. We also have to think the same about fish, and some things we do with fish are equally not humane and not acceptable.
Absolutely. And I want to go back to this sign, everyone has the right to healthy and sustainable food. Everyone also has the right to work that they can feel good about. And right now the livestock sector does not provide that work. You have all mentioned, I'll go to you in a minute, Lasse, I promise, younger generations leaving farms, or, younger generations need more high-tech solutions. What I am impressed by, and also given a lot of hope by, is that so many young people, and I'm sure there are some of you in this room who are doing this, are becoming involved in food and agriculture systems in very different ways, whether as researchers or as farmers yourselves and other ways. And so I think, people will go back to farming in different ways. They will bring some of those higher tech solutions with them to combine with low tech solutions. So there is a lot of hope there. And I think that is part of a just transition, at least the way I sort of try to imagine it with my small brain. So Lasse, I'd like to turn to you now.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I agree with the aspect of young people. Although I'm mainly thinking now, was it 21 beef burgers or was it Beyond Meat burgers?
I think it was beef.
Okay, well, good point. So at 50 by 40, we have been operating for a few years now with what we call just livestock transition. And it's, in all honesty, transparency, born very much out of the energy transition, which I used to work a lot on. And what I used to say when I was meeting with decision makers to convince them of the importance of shifting from fossil fuel-based economy to renewable energy-based economy was that when you invest $1 million in fossil fuels, you create 7 jobs. When you invest $1 million in renewable energy, you create 14 jobs. They're better paid, they're safer, there's more gender equality, it's much better. So we need to start making that same analysis within the livestock transition. And there is good news. There has been a few initial studies. Last year, the Inter-American Development Bank and the International Labour Organization, they did a study looking at what would happen if the Latin America and the Caribbean were to shift towards more planned forward diet by 2030, coinciding with the SDGs. And it actually showed there would be a net loss of jobs of 4 million, but there would be a net gain of jobs of 19 million, which means net completely.
What number?
4 million lost jobs, 19 million gained.
Wow.
So net 15 million new jobs. And again, they would be safer, they would be better. And I'm not talking about your production methods, Pete, I'm talking about CAFOs, right? That's what we're targeting here. And it kind of also makes sense, like, do you want to work in a slaughterhouse or in a processing line where you're exposed to all kinds of issues? We have the big AMR issues, and it's dangerous. People get hurt all the time. Or would you like to work more with crops or external farming? It's self-evident. So the numbers are there, and we need to do much more analysis. And essentially, my job here at the COP is to be able to come to a decision maker, to a country delegation, and I need to be able to put forward a strategy that makes the following 4 ministers happy: Minister of Agriculture, Health, Climate Change, and Finance.
Right.
And the finance part is the most important, because the second you can talk about job creation, boosting the GDP, or shifting to circular economy in a different way, that's the winning point,
Right.
because then nobody can argue against it.
Right. I mean, I think that shows how these discussions have changed over the last 10 or 15 years. We're not just talking about agriculture ministers and influencing them. We're talking about this whole range of actors who need to be convinced and part of the conversation. Stineke, I'd like to turn to you now.
Yeah, thanks. 3 points, I think. One short one. I think when I mentioned the subsidies, I didn't say to take away subsidies from farmers, not at all. What I wanted to say is that we need to shift subsidies to a more diverse range of crops or more diverse production systems. That brings me to my second point. When we started this conversation, it was all about meat. And then I said, no, it's not just meat. We need to look at the entire diet. And now we are speaking about livestock systems. No, it's not livestock. Let's look at the opportunities, the possibilities of mixed farming systems. There's so many complementarities there. There's the manure that nourish or that feed the crops. We need to look much more at the opportunities of closed systems. And I'm quite sure there's other people in this panel that know much more about it than I do. I just wanted to make that point. And that is also important for our fellow farmers, smallholder farmers in not in this part of the world, not in the northern or the western hemisphere, but rather the south. There's so many smallholder farmers that practice mixed farming and closed farming systems. So we need a way to support them in order to nourish themselves and their families. Going to my third point now, nourishing families. So back to the consumers. Yes, consumers will have to be given more choices to opt for sustainable, healthy diets, as I said. And we do have the tools there, but we cannot blame or say or tell consumers, you are, as a person alone, responsible to shift or transform that food system. Of course, we can help consumers by good messaging, but we also need to look at that food environment. We need to look at that place, that environment where consumers purchase or they pick and choose their food elements to put in their baskets that are part of their diets. And that food environment also needs to change because it's too easy and too cheap now for consumers to opt for the less healthy options, whereas with the right subsidies, the right education, less of the wrong advertising, it will be easier for consumers to make those right choices. And that is the same in the north, in the south, in the west, and in the east. I just wanted to make these 3 points.
No, and I think those are great points to make. And you mentioned this idea of supporting mixed farming systems, and we need a way to support them. So Lee and Aarti, that has to be part of this just transition. How do we support farmers? And so if both of you could comment on that, that would be great.
I will say that, at Aleph Farms and in general, our belief is that we are looking at how we can transition the food systems, the meat sector to more sustainable and resiliency. That means also agriculture. So we need sustainable livestock agriculture, both for the climate, both for the people. We talk about subsidies, but there are issues like crop insurance. You know that in the US, they are only insured 5 crops. So so it really does not allow diversity and more regenerative and additional practices. So I absolutely agree with you with that as well. So we want to move to more sustainable agriculture. We want to implement innovation so we can complement sustainable agriculture, not replace it, but complement it, whether it's incremental and innovation that can really enhance sustainable agriculture and more transformational innovation like a plant-based or cultivated meat that can really support the supply and the need for food security. And then we, of course, believe in responsible consumption, whether in specific areas in the world we're talking about more reduction versus other areas in the world where we need to increase consumption. And last, and this is, I think, the umbrella of all of this, is the government and the policy that needs to help us support it. So I'm listening to you and you're talking about these influencers and it's all about education. It is all about education. And I went back to my hotel room the other night and I turned on the TV and Kinder was putting on, this chocolate Kinder was putting on this advertising, and what they talk about is how they have these small portions of chocolate, and this is the portion for you to have because it's a perfect portion. And that's something that can be also education from the policymakers, but also education from the food systems themselves. But education is critical throughout this whole. To create a real systemic change, you need that as well, because our next generations, our future generations, Gen Z, we see this. We see they're seeking out for this new
Yeah.
way
Not
of
everyone's
us living
Kylie
this
Jenner.
life, and we need to help support them with that. So yeah, I absolutely believe, and this is all, of course, with these collaborations. So we talk about diversity in plants and crops, but we also need to think about how we can work together in collaboration, the innovators together with the agricultural, the different stakeholders within the meat sector to work together to the same goals. And that, I think, is where we can create that just transition.
I mean, nothing particularly new to add to this, to what others have already discussed. I mean, I think from a just transition perspective, I almost, the fact is, it's somewhat of an interesting concept right now. I mean, I'm sure if you talk to a farmer in the US who's a contract farmer with one of the large companies, I think he'd be pretty happy to transition given the pressures they face right now. I mean, what you saw happening during the pandemic was, I mean, across the board, companies, sort of were, especially, this was especially in beef, where the price of cattle was the difference between the price of cattle and what was actually sort of being sold by the large conglomerates. There was a huge price differential, right? And on the retailer side, they were getting squeezed because they couldn't really raise the price of beef because they were worried about impacting consumers. And so what ended up happening was really that the farmer ended up getting a much lower sort of the price for his cattle, while record profits were being made by some of the large companies. I mean, and it's a story that you see play out in at least in America again and again and again, where the contract farming system really, it's extremely punitive to the farmer right now. We're talking about just transition. I mean, the fact is that these are all extremely lofty goals we have, right? Because today the predominant system, again, and my colleagues will laugh when they hear me say this, but it's just the predominant system of waste management in the US right now is large football field size holes in the ground called lagoons that just houses about millions of gallons of pig waste. So this is the predominant system of waste management, manure management across most companies. We track these companies. We talk about, and these are farmers who are actually implementing these practices. Nobody is really talking to them about nutrient management. Nobody is talking to them, providing them with incentives to, sort of shift away from this type of absolutely horrific system that has all kinds of impact in, just for surrounding communities, for the local water systems, for drinking water systems. It's absolutely devastating ecosystems, but nobody's giving them the right incentives. Whose responsibility is that? I mean, a lot of times, because these are local governments that make, or the state governments that make the rules or have any enforcement authority at all, the state governments are not willing to exercise that authority, because there's a lot of lobbying and advocacy that happens. There is a lot of the economic component to it keeps coming in the way. So you end up having huge number of farms that have very, very little regulation that can safeguard these communities that live next to these farms, or the local ecosystems that live next to these farms. So, I mean, if we don't, I mean, and that is the reality of industrial agriculture today. So unless there is a concerted effort by governments to start stipulating some very, very clear regulations for farmers, for meat companies, or what role do meat companies play in advocating the sort of these practices, better practices for farmers, at increased cost to them, we're not going to see any transition, to get just or sustainable. I mean, it just has to happen. We are at a very, very sort of our very nascent stage right now, where sort of the bulk of the sector exists, and this discussion that's happening today is much to the left of that. There's nothing there that's we're talking about two different worlds.
Yeah. That was not my intention. I wanted to be more in the center. I think we have a communication problem. I'm really glad that you brought up, and I do want to turn to questions, and I know, Brent, I think you have a comment in a second, but you brought up the role of lobbying or lobbies, particularly in the United States, where a lot of these CAFOs exist, and those large lagoon pits that you mentioned are devastating to communities and groundwater and farmers themselves. But that takes, changing that means we have to change how we do a lot of things in the United States. We need campaign finance reform, which would be huge. A lot of this, I think, would simply go away if lobbyists didn't have as much power as they have now. A lot of this would change. And so that, I think, is a fundamental question when we're talking about, because the US is responsible for so much of this. Anyway, it's something that I just wanted to put out there. Brent, over to you.
Yeah, I'll be quick because then we can save some time for, is coming to the role of like the role of like the consumer, which you were talking about in education. I have less faith in the consumer and in education. I think we put too much onus on the individual to make these change.
Yeah.
And we say, oh, just educate them, put labels on, they're gonna go out there, they're gonna make the right choices. I don't think people do. I don't think that's how most people think. We probably think that way. But most people, they're going into the shopping market and they're rushed for time. They got their kids behind them and they just grab things. Nobody has the time to read labels. Is this sustainable? No, they just grab things. And they do things based on decisions that are easy, comfortable, and economic. And until we support the individual with the top-down policies that creates that environment that you were talking about, the right environment, where you walk into a store where red meat is treated like a luxury good, and it becomes expensive, people will only buy it once a week because that's what they can afford. If they can afford to buy it every single day, they'll buy it every single day, no matter how much we educate them, I think. I really do. So that's where it's merging the top down and the bottom up coming together in the sweet spot of being able to change a system. And I think that's where we have to focus, is both of those coming together.
Well, and I think that's a very hopeful sweet spot because we have this new generation of eaters and consumers and producers who are thinking in different ways than all of us grew up thinking. And I think that's very important. I think we can turn to questions now. My colleague Alexina has a roving mic, who she's stealing from Lee. And so I'm sure there are lots of questions. I see one over here and then one up here.
Hello, my name is Mads Fischer-Møller. I'm living here in Scotland. I'm a professor in food policy. I was just wondering, I'm speaking to a group of food agencies tomorrow. So what would you say to kind of like food authorities, food agencies who are new to climate? They are usually regulating food can be so dangerous for us. What do you need from a business perspective from Aleph Farms and also from Lasse, from some of you who works in creating partnership? What do you want? What kind of approach do you want from a food authority, from a food regulator? And what should I tell them tomorrow when they actually want to go into sustainability and climate, but really doesn't know what to do?
Go ahead, everyone, jump in.
Shall I? Will anyone back me up there? No, this is the question, of course. And what I would say is, it's anyone could say this. It's no one size fits all. But what I think it's important that if you speak with food regulators, they need to look at what is possible in a local context. And I know you and I, Brent, we have worked together on this paper once. Ecologists, environmentalists, and nutritionists need to work more together. And I've been rereading some documents lately, and I saw that call again, and I saw there was this call for people who work on biodiversity and people who work on nutrition to work together to really try to find solutions that fit a local context. Mm-hmm. And once we have then a local solution in a local setting, we can go to the regulators to ask for their support and build that environment that also Brent described just now, and I did as well, to make it happen. I mean, it's not an easy task because it's not that, for example, milk is always wrong or milk is always right. But you need to find that balance, and you need to describe that very fine balance in a local context. So maybe that's not the answer you were looking for, but it's like, great.
Thank you, Aarti.
No, I was just very quickly going to add, I mean, it's a fairly sort of expansive question that you had, but I'd say, for example, I'd be interested, I mean, the UK, for example, has requirement that all farmers have a nutrient management plan. To my point earlier, nobody does anything with this nutrient management plan, at least in the US. I think a sort of tangible question for me that I'm really interested in is who's enforcing these nutrient management plans? What's in them? What support are you providing to these farmers to make sure that at a base case, there is some level of some process and some system in place to make sure that the farming that's currently happening isn't terribly harmful to the environment.
Thank you so much. I think there was another question up here.
Just wait, very quick on that.
Sorry, Brent.
I would resist the temptation to want to give them a solution. Policymakers want to have a couple very easy, simple things that are going to solve the problem, and it's those panaceas that you said, and they don't exist. Encourage them to do the hard work, encourage them to figure out the local context, and then dive into what it means for that particular situation, and really encourage them to think systematically about the entire system, and to start trusting the science.
Absolutely. I want to make a point on that. I mean, while policymakers may not benefit from, getting a few silver bullets, what they do benefit is from storytelling. They benefit from examples of what could work in different places. And I think that kind of storytelling, I think communication is so key here. Go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, I suppose for me, just a bit like a broken record on this, that certainly in the UK, which is the only place I know anything about, in the UK there's a very concentrated hourglass system, 300,000, how many 100,000 farmers, 60 million consumers, and a handful of businesses in the middle. And what we've seen at this COP is, more of the sort of businesses in that middle sector committing to sustainability goals. I haven't really heard so much about the health goals, to be honest. And it seems to me that there's a perfectly good case, just as the EU's made a case for regulating car manufacturers to achieve certain standards. If you don't achieve these standards across the board, you'll be fined. There's a perfectly good case for saying, you control the food environment. If you don't deliver us a healthy and sustainable diet, we're going to fine you the further you are away. Not in where you put your shelves, how much you advertise after tea time, all that stuff that we end up regulating, but what you actually sell to people. So we need to align the incentives in the system with a sustainable, healthy diet. And at the moment, they're not aligned. So it's not surprising we don't have healthy and sustainable diets.
Lee, you wanted to comment?
I agree with that completely.
I don't think it's on.
No, I agree with that completely. I actually do think that private sector does need to help shape the policymakers. I think it's not, of course they need to do the work, but I think we need to work together. But I also think that we need to support incentives for safe, I think food security in the end needs to be the main goal. And in food security, we have affordability, we have nutritional accessibility, we need safety within that, and we need resilient supply chains and resilient food systems. And I think that is the framework that policymakers need to do, is to create incentives to achieve those goals. And whether it is creating it from inception, whether it is transitioning towards something that's more sustainable, this is where the inspiration, the aspiration needs to go to. And that's what I would say to them.
Great. Lasse?
Thanks a lot. I totally agree. And two quick things. One is we need to look much more at the externalized cost of food production. And actually we need to talk about the true value of food and not the true cost of food, because the true value takes into consideration farmers and so forth. I think that's really important. And to the point about the discrepancy between dietary guidelines and so forth, I think it would be a very interesting exercise in many countries, not in all, but in many countries, to look at the national dietary guidelines, combine them with what the policy says, and combine them with what the financial flows says. Like in the EU, for instance, would be national financial flows, EU financial flows, and so forth, and how the MDBs like the World Bank and the IMF and so forth fit into that as well, because that is totally misaligned at the moment, and it would be interesting to see how that could be more aligned.
Great, thank you. There's this question up front.
Thank you very much. Firstly, thank you for a wonderful panel and all the work that you do in each of your organizations. And it's been so interesting listening, and I totally agree, it's a very complex issue. But now I'll put you on the spot, because we've got to look at what's the next step. To go to what is the next step that each of you would take. If you could wave a magic wand and you're there at your desk on Monday, what's the one step that you'd go, that's going to get us in the right direction?
I've got two. First one is we've got to get all parts of the food system into NDCs. Currently, we're measuring parts of it. We're not measuring diets. And what measured matters. And we have to work with the Cornevia process and the NDCs and get all aspects in there and measured. Second thing is we need a food day at COP27.
Yay.
Period. Hands down. And until COP and these large multilateral processes take food seriously, it won't be taken seriously. So we need to push for that and get it in there and talk to the right people. And whatever levers we all need to pull, we've got to pull to make that happen.
Fantastic. Anyone else want to comment?
What he said.
Right. Drop the microphone. Great. Any other questions? I see one in the back, Alexina.
Oh, thank you. Hi, this is Andrea Christina. One thing that I think is important when we think about global scales is the concept of distribution. And so can you comment a little bit on that wrinkle or that caveat? Like when we talk about these things in a sustainable future and diets, how can we talk about or acknowledge the fact that maybe even today we're producing enough calories or nutrients for the world, but they're concentrated and a lot of times wasted in certain areas of the globe. They're not, if we could distribute them, let's say, what does that mean? And what does that also mean for the emissions associated with distributing food from certain parts of the world to other parts of the world? So yeah, if you could just comment a little bit on distribution and maybe unequal access to the calories that we are producing today. So it's not about production. If you could just comment on what happens when we produce that, and how do we acknowledge the future when we acknowledge the challenges of today? Thank you so much.
Sure.
This one, okay. So I absolutely agree with you. I think local production is critical for resiliency. And I think we also need to shorten our supply chains to a certain level. Of course, there is elements of economy of scale that we need to take as something critical. We look at the meat sector, there are areas in the world where we have agriculture that's rich, like in the US and Europe, and then there's areas in the world where we are critically importing a lot of our foods. And that is something that we really work on a lot. I mean, at Aleph Farms specifically, that's one of the things that we're really targeting, is creating local productions for areas where you don't have agriculture. I mean, we work with Israel. In Israel, we import over 80% of our beef. China imports 90% of the beef. UAE, Singapore, these are all countries that are craving food security and local production. And that is something that we are truly trying to support and aim, because agriculture, and this is something that we also have to understand. We live now in this global world, but in the end, different regions in the world have different capabilities of the way they can produce different foods. And that's something that I think is really critical. So I absolutely think that we need to focus on creating more local production, work with local suppliers. I think that will also support resiliency. I think it will also support times of pandemics, times of climate events, to stay more resilient, and that there are areas that we need to understand that different areas in the world will demand different ways of producing food. And that's something that needs to be understood more. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Thank you.
Well, I'll just say one thing is, so for example, there's been a lot of criticism right now of multilateral development banks where there's a lot of financing that's provided to move these systems of production from here to developing countries, because it seems like the way of enhancing food security or improving access to proteins, but there's no consideration of the externalities associated with this type of production, right? So, what you're also exporting is, huge, feed inputs that now have to go into these systems, the antibiotics use, all of these, poor waste management practices, because really, none of these companies really have a sense of what good waste management sounds like or looks like. So I think that is something that I think there's somewhat of a contradiction there that I feel there is in development finance at this stage, that this idea that we should be, to increase access to protein, that means sort of sending what works here and actually doesn't, sort of exporting that to different countries as a way of doing that, I think is seems like a poorly thought out policy. So yeah, I think that's something that generally policy experts need to guard against.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give Pete Richie the last word.
On that question about distribution, I think fundamentally, as Raj was saying last night, the fundamental issue here is about gender equity. So even within households, it tends to be women and girls who are the most likely to be having lower calories. And so I think that's one part of it. And we need to start moving, because it's smallholder farmers in particular that are most food insecure, represent the highest level of people who are actually likely to be short of food, then we do need to maintain those incomes. And at the moment, we have got some very harmful subsidies, particularly in the place I know a little bit about in South Asia, where they're subsidizing nitrogen, where the subsidy goes to the companies that produce the nitrogen, substituting that with more income support and support for agroecological farming could really maintain incomes or enhance incomes and enhance food security. And China's gone some way towards that, as I said earlier.
Great. Thank you all so much. So let's give this panel and these panelists a round of applause, please. And thanks to all of you.